Screw it. We'll do this one. Alright. So we're gonna do this one. This one is the man who drove across America on a $50 bet. And this one is done by Alternate History Hub. I don't know if we've reacted to them before. So, this could be very interesting. I have no idea. So, let's find out why a man drove cross country on a bet.
In a private social club, a lively debate was about to begin. Club members were fixated on a discussion about cars. The question was whether these new horseless carriages could ever replace the horse. But it wasn't much of an argument,
Right.
because most of these club members agreed that the car was a fad, a trend that would only temporarily remain relevant before people came to their senses. Now, this might
Really?
seem silly today, but honestly at the time, most believed it. This was 1903. Almost nobody owned a car. For the most part, they were just too expensive. The cheapest budget models would usually cost $650 or so.
Yeah, well, 11, exactly right. 1903, $50 is about the equivalent of, I'd say probably about 1,000 for the time period. The $50 was a lot of money.
Which was about
Yeah,
a year and a
thousands of
half
much,
of the average worker's salary.
Couple
And
hundred.
this was the low-end stuff. If you wanted a nicer vehicle, that might cost 10 times as much as what most people would make in a year. These were for the wealthy. And even then, not everybody had one. Because the reality was, they weren't really that useful. People had horses and carriages, and society was built around this. You generally lived and worked in the same town. If you needed to go across the country or another state, you just used the railroads. The transcontinental railroad could get you from coast to-
Really? That's what. Okay, so I was actually close with my guess. Wait, 21K for $50? The 1791 seems about right. That was pretty much my guess when I made my initial guess. 21K. No, that doesn't seem right. Oh, you were referring to the $600. Okay, okay. Andrew, I did not realize what it was you were quoting there for that number. Okay, I understand now. No, Peeve, the 21K was for the high-end one that was costing $600. That's $600 in 1902 money is like 21K. Whereas the $50 is about 1,800.
That useful. People had horses and carriages. If you needed to go, a road could get you from coast to coast in 3.5 days. The car couldn't get you from
Because of
coast
course,
to coast
Peeve.
ever. Very few roads in the United States were paved, because why would they need to be? Outside of the major cities, you generally expect to find a dirt path. And out west, in the most undeveloped regions miles from civilization, a car was useless. Even in the cities, in the ideal circumstances, these cars were extremely unreliable.
Oh my God!
If you wanted to just take a drive for even a few miles, it wouldn't be too unexpected to have some mechanical failure, or need a repair along the way. This is a time before any standards of what a car should even be existed. Some models had electric engines, some steam, and some powered by gasoline. Sometimes the steering wheel was on the left side, or the right. Or you might not even have one. Some cars had 3 wheels, some 4, and most cars didn't have doors or roofs or windshields. They were seen as unsafe,
Yeah.
a nuisance for pedestrians and cyclists alike. Some states
I mean, given all the descriptors here with all the various styles of cars and how unsafe they were, I can honestly understand why the people in that men's club would think, oh, this is just a fad. That's kind of an understandable opinion to have, given the state of cars at the time.
went as far as passing laws to ban cars, or at least limit their use with extreme restrictions. An automobile back then was this uncommon, expensive, impractical means of transportation that was seen as little more than a status symbol for the wealthy. They were not seen as legitimate competition to horses. Now, as this debate went on, a guest at the club decided to chime in. His name was Horatio Nelson Jackson. He was not from San Francisco, he was from Vermont. Years prior, he had been a doctor but fell ill to tuberculosis and left his practice behind. He was in town because he was heading home after searching for gold and silver in Alaska and Mexico. Horatio liked cars. You could call him something of a motoring enthusiast. He wasn't an expert by any means, or even a proficient mechanic. He was just a fan, and he didn't take too—
Well, and let's face it, many car guys today are the same. They just try and pretend like they're mechanically inclined. You know, the ones that basically take their cars and turn them into like shitbox racers probably don't know how to actually do it. They just had someone else do it, and then they said, okay, what did you do? So they can just parrot it back to sound like they're smart. So, not a whole lot's changed from 1902 in that respect.
Too kindly to somebody trash-talking about this cool new technology. He believed that the car could replace the horse. It had potential, and he would prove it to these naysayers. So he made a bet.
Yeah, Dre, so you are the exception, not the rule.
$50, and he claimed he would get a car and drive it from San Francisco to New York City in under 90 days. This seemed unreasonable to the members of the club, because it had never been done before, and people had tried. Every car manufacturer would love to have made the first car to drive across the country, and some had gone through great planning and expense to try and make it happen, but they never could. It was just too difficult. The infrastructure did not exist. How could you cross the Great Plains? What if the car broke down? How would you get repairs in a timely manner? Even with seemingly unlimited funds and months of meticulous planning, these corporate-sponsored teams couldn't come close to driving across the United States. And then this guy, this random guy, is betting that he'll be the first to do it. With no experience, or training, or motivation, beyond the fact that he wants to do it. So they accepted the bet. A $50 wager might seem—
Are we about to see the emergence of the main character? Is this going to turn into a quasi-fat electrician story about the main character? Because if it is, I'm here for it.
Seem a bit low for such a massive endeavor, and that's because it was. Don't get me wrong, $50 was still a lot of money in 1903. It would be the equivalent of around $1,700 in 2023. Horatio's wife was traveling with him at the time, and when he told her about this bet, she surprisingly didn't seem to mind. She wasn't gonna ride along with him, she just took the train back to Vermont. He was going to need somebody to join him in this adventure though, because, you know, he wasn't a mechanic. But he knew one. Sewell K. Crocker, a 22-year-old former bike racer turned auto mechanic. Now, there's some discrepancies of whether Sewell and Horatio knew each other well before this adventure. Some statements claim Sewell taught Horatio and his wife to drive cars before, but regardless, Sewell was coming along. He suggested that Horatio should buy a 1903 Winton touring car, which he believed to be the most reliable model around. It was a fancy car, and it came at a price. Since this was a fancy, reliable model around, it was a fancy—
Look at these wheels! Now, I'm guessing this is like probably a museum piece that they just basically PNG'd. But look at how the rubber is peeled off of the wheel. You have to wonder how easily that's gonna happen out in, like, the wilds. Like, how quickly this is gonna happen out in the wilds. I can only imagine that after, like, 100 miles, if that, your rubber would probably be fucking gone. Hey. But you know what it kind of reminds me of, Drysdale? The Time Machine. Was it H.G. Wells' Time Machine? It kind of reminds me of that. Yeah, like wooden with the rubber tire covering the wood wheel. Yeah, so it was a wooden wheel with essentially a rubber sheath around it. But this kind of reminds me of the H.G. Wells Time Machine in a small way. The Time Machine was obviously more grand with stuff coming off of it, but the basic design, especially with the lanterns, kind of reminds me of it, honestly.
Fancy car, and it came at a price. Since this was a fancy car, not a lot of people had this specific model, especially out west. Most of the time, people would order cars directly from the factory, so you weren't really gonna find something like this at a local car dealership. Luckily, a Wells Fargo executive in San Francisco had that exact model and offered it to Horatio for $3,000. This was about $500 over the list price, and the car already had quite a few miles on it. The tires were not in great shape, but Horatio bought it anyway. If you were wondering, $3,000 in 1903 money would be like $100,000 today, which is pretty expensive and
What? What? Oh, okay. I was like, what the hell just happened?
excessive when you consider that this is in an attempt to win a $50 bet. Now, the reason Horatio had this kind of money is all because his wife's family was incredibly wealthy. They got their fortune from something called a...
Wow, not only is he a doctor, he married into fucking money. And yeah, well, but Hoseki, the bet was for $50. He's doing it for the clout. This is basically the modern day equivalent. This is like the 1902 equivalent of, clout chasing. Well, actually, back then it was probably a matter of pride because he said, "I think your car can do it," and the other guy said, "Well, no, it can't." And he's like, "All right, fine, I'll prove it to you." So I think it might be a combo platter of pride and clout. I think it's a combination of both. Because back then, the two were a little indistinguishable from one another. Clout really wasn't a big thing. So I think there's probably more pride involved with it.
Celery Curial, whatever that was. And he was
they
going to
just
need
went
that
higher
money
on the dollar
because
on
this
Cafe.
was going to be expensive. He named his expensive new car the Vermont because he was from Vermont. Makes sense. Over the next few days, he got some supplies, plopped those in the back of the car, and just 4 days after making this bet, Horatio and Crocker set out on a journey. With no expertise or preparation, these two were going on the first cross-country road trip in American history. Horatio may not have had a plan on how he was going to get to New York, but he did have a general strategy in mind. He wanted to avoid the roughest terrain, the mountains, the deserts, so from San Francisco, they just went north. Pretty quickly, the true scale of this...
Wait. He wants to avoid the roughest terrain. And while initially this will make sense going north, granted he's going to be going through a shit ton of forests, you're still running in mountains here. Unless he's going to go up here, take a jog to the right, and then cut back down here to go across the plains. That may be what he's doing. He might go across Idaho here, and then cut back down. He's got to avoid the Dakotas to hit the Midwest plains. Well, the problem is if he goes south, if he goes through south here, you've got mountainous regions here before you reach the deserts and the plains. That's, I think, probably why he went. Or sorry, I said Dakotas. I misspoke. I was referring to like Wyoming and them, not the Dakotas.
Went north.
And yeah, he wanted to avoid deserts.
The true scale of this challenge became apparent. Almost immediately, the car needed repairs, and it would continue to need repairs every few miles. The Winton's top speed was a humble 30 miles per hour, but it wasn't like they were going to reach that on the rough roads in the west. This was going to be a slow journey. As they went through the first few towns, they started to get quite a bit of attention from the locals. Not because they were trying to make history by crossing the United States in a car. No, it was just because they had a car. Cars weren't common, even in the cities. So most people in these small towns had never seen one of these things. They didn't even know if they would see one again. Every time
Eh,
these guys would show up in a small town, it would be a big story. The newspapers would report that a car was coming to town, so people would line up and down the streets. Kids would try to get out of school. The whole town would stop what it was doing just to try and see these two guys driving a car. They'd ask for rides. It would be a big event. Rumors would spread across the countryside. A car's coming to town. And this just brought a huge surge of excitement through these rather isolated communities. A lot of people didn't really know what these things were, or what they were capable of.
Andrea, a third time? Okay, post it in Stream Chat General. We'll take a look afterwards.
And because of that, some seem to have some pretty grand expectations. There's reports that people expected this car to zoom through the center of town at like 90 miles per hour. It was going to be so fast you couldn't even see it. The car was also a sensation since Horatio and Crocker might have to spend a few nights at each location, because the car was breaking down constantly. Some repairs were simpler than others, and maybe a blacksmith could throw something together, but if some specialty part broke, the only way to get a replacement was to contact the manufacturer and wait for them to ship it across the country, which might take a few days. They had to stop for supplies frequently too, as much of their stuff would fly off the car since it was a pretty bumpy ride. Even if they had 3 months to make this journey, I don't think any—
Wait. After, like, the first couple of times, wouldn't you think, like, okay, this shit's flying off the car pretty easily. Maybe we should just strap it the fuck down? Like, at some point, they have to realize, okay, the car is riding rough. Shit is flying out of it with every bump. Not even bungee cords. Fucking rope! Get some rope or some leather strapping. They had that back then. And just tie your supplies down. Like, why didn't they do that? That's like, even for 1902, that's fucking basic thought processing there. Well, no, not truck straps, right? But just like tie-down straps of some kind. You know? Limp! Yes, Johnny. But I'm not talking about tying me to the hood of the car or anything like that. I'm talking about tying down the supplies.
Anybody genuinely expected them to get
they
to
probably
New
could
York
find
City
better than
on
size
time.
a rope.
As they got further away from the western coast, they saw less and less people. The roads turned into trails, which turned into untamed wilderness.
Okay, hang on. Chat, remember 906. Remember that. What was the model of this thing? Hang on. Alright, hang on. Winton touring car. Okay, hang on. Let's see. How is it powered? How is it powered? Okay, here we go. Slightly used 2-cylinder, 20 horsepower, 65 kilowatt, touring car and hired mechanic. Okay, hang on. Okay. So, it held 11 to 12 gallons of fuel, which is enough to run the car for about 175 miles on normal roads. In case of emergencies, drivers would strap on extra tanks, carry more fuel and cylinder oil. So, it was a gas-powered vehicle. And you could get 175 miles on a road before you needed to refuel. So, my guess is they probably strapped on a couple of extra gas tanks to refuel it until their next stop. Granted, yeah, this was, where are they going to get more fuel? Who the fuck knows? I'm guessing they had to plan this out in some way, but I don't fucking know.
If they ran into a shallow creek, they might be lucky to drive through it. but more than likely they'd have to bring out the old block and tackle to get this car unstuck through the thick mud. If there was a boulder in the way, you gotta move the boulder. Every few miles had some sort of obstacle. Getting traction was a challenge. It might require ripping up fences and getting those under the car. Without road signs, or roads, it was difficult for these guys to figure out where exactly they were going, which sometimes resulted in some backtracking until they found their bearings. The best case scenario was to run into the railroad tracks, which they could then take to cross some of the more difficult terrain. In the lesser populated areas, they would come across people who hadn't seen another human in weeks, and relied on their generosity for lodging and food. But sometimes, nobody was around. They might go days without eating, and this all became pretty dangerous when you consider the possibility that the car was constantly breaking down. On occasion, the car would just come to a halt, and there was no easy way to fix it on the road, so they'd have to hope that somebody would just come along and find them. At one point, this assistance came from a guy on a horse, who then had to tow the car back to town with his horse. Because this is 1903, obviously there weren't any gas stations. They'd have to find local shops that sold fuel for farm equipment and hope that they didn't get swindled by opportunistic businessmen.
Okay, I think I was talking over that. That's how they got fuel.
Obviously, there weren't any gas stations. They'd have to find local shops that sold fuel for farm equipment and hope that they didn't get swindled by opportunistic businessmen. The weather could also be quite an issue. Even just driving normally, the crew wore goggles since, you know, there wasn't a windshield. But without a door, without any protection, they were stuck in the rain, thunder, or worse, with nowhere to run. Most days Horatio wrote back to his wife, who he called Swipes for some reason. He kept telling her,
Swipes? Was bro on fucking Tinder before Tinder or something? Why are you calling your wife Swipes? There's a backstory to that I'm sorry, I just want to know. This deserves its own story of why this man is calling his wife Swipes. And for all I know, it's an even more interesting story than this one.
Well, it's been pretty rough so far, but I'm sure once we get to the next town, it's gonna be a lot easier. And he just kept saying that for every new town, and it never got easier. In the most remote regions of the sparsely populated West, the car became even more of a spectacle. Sometimes too much of a spectacle. They encountered a man who had likely never seen or even heard of a car before, and he was so scared by this mysterious oncoming vehicle that he scrambled to set his horses free. He thought it was a train that had derailed, and it was coming.
Don't hurt me, Thomas! Thomas, don't, please, stop! Thomas! Oh God, Thomas!
Straight for him. Horatio left his jacket in a hotel in Idaho, and when he realized that, he drove back to the town to retrieve it. When he got there, a man asked him if he wanted a new mascot for his journey. It was a dog. His name was Bud. Bud was a good dog. He traveled the countryside wearing these goggles, and people just loved him. Why wouldn't they? He was a dog riding a car. To get from San Francisco to Cheyenne, it took 42 days. At that pace, the prospect of making it across...
Yeah, 42 days to get this far, and he's got to go all the way here. That's sounding like an impossible task at this point. I don't... No, I think it was 60? 90. 90 days. He has to do it in 90 days. So, actually, no, well, yeah. If he took him 40 here, another 40 would get him here, which means he would have 10 days to get here, if they followed on the same track.
Cheyenne, it took 42 days. At that pace, the prospect of making it across the country in under 90 days seemed less realistic, but they carried on anyway. You see, this road trip was about to turn into a race. On June 20th, two other men set out from San Francisco with the same plan as Horatio and Crocker. They were going to drive to New York City but they had some big names backing them up. The Packard Motor Car Company was sponsoring their trip, and this was all planned well before Horatio made his bet. Every aspect of the route, the placement of supplies, repairs, it was all planned in detail. In fact, they were...
Okay. This is starting to sound like it's going to turn into an underdog story. I think this is... If he wins this, holy shit. This is starting... He's just become the underdog.
They were so confident in their success that this was really more of a publicity stunt. They would take breaks waiting for film to arrive to capture the moment. This was all to show off that Packard's cars could make the journey, and the crew didn't even need to consider it much of a race. Horatio and Crocker didn't have that backing, and they certainly didn't have this planned out. Then on July 6th, another team sponsored by Oldsmobile also left San Francisco. This was now a three-way race, but Horatio and Crocker had no idea at the time they were even in one. They were in the middle of the country and just hadn't gotten the news yet. The problem now was that the Packard team was actually about to overtake them in a few days. Without having to worry about waiting for repairs, with all of this actually planned in advance, they were moving at nearly twice the rate as Horatio and Crocker. Now, once the two found out they had some competition, it didn't really change anything. Horatio was still confident that he could not only make it to New York City, but he would win this race that he just found out he was a part of. I love this man. As they finally made it to the Midwest, they started getting some different reactions. It wasn't the car getting the attention now. Cars were far more common the further east you went, but Horatio and Crocker, and especially Bud, had gotten pretty famous over the past few weeks.
Because, of course, especially Bud. Who could possibly compete with the bestest boy? So naturally, Bud would get the lion's share of the attention.
They had made it a decent way across the country, and had tackled the most difficult part of their journey. The further they moved east, the better the roads would be, and they'd actually have access to more parts, and lodging, and food. While it wasn't going to be easy, they had shown they were definitely capable of getting to New York City. It was no longer really a question of whether they'd make it, it was just when. The Winton Company, the manufacturer who made Horatio's beloved car, contacted the team and offered to sponsor the rest of their journey. They would have access to all the resources they would need. Supplies, parts, repairs, and the trip would become significantly easier. Horatio declined this. The other two teams with sponsors...
He declined it. Chat? That's kind of based. He told the car company, suck off, well, no, Pactra again. It's not a clout thing, it's a pride thing. This was 100% pride. He said, I started this on my own, I'm gonna finish it on my own. So that is absolute pride and not clout. And when the Winton Car Company said, oh, we'll fund you for the rest, he's like, no, you didn't fund me in the beginning. I'm going to prove that I don't need to have a huge backer to make this happen. And Patrick, I'd say beyond the, the bet. Yeah, the bet. Yeah. Yeah, this was, well, yeah, and maybe he thought that by taking the Winton Car Company on as a backer, it might, like, welch the bets in some way. But he absolutely did this. I'm betting he did this for pride, because he's like, I finished it on my own. I started it on my own. I'm going to finish it on my own to prove that it can be done. Absolutely, I think that's his reasoning.
Might have started off strong, but now they were having their own issues. The Packard Company pretty much had this in the bag. They were about to pass Horatio within just a few days. The marketing team for the Packard Company didn't plan a route of convenience or ease. Instead, they picked the most photogenic path, which meant going into canyons, and even the Rocky Mountains. Without roads in these early cars, this was nearly impassable. especially in a reasonable time frame, and it slowed them down to a
Hey, hey.
point where they pretty much lost any chance of winning. As for the Oldsmobile
Oh,
team, well, they started so late they were probably never going to win anyway. By the time Horatio and Crocker, and of course Bud, got to the east, it was clear they were about to win. So now, every stop they made resulted in huge crowds, tons of publicity, because this was history being made. It was clear that they were going to be the first people to cross the country in a car, and they were. On July 26th, they made it to New York City at 4:30 in the morning. The plan was
wow.
to cross the country in 90 days. The journey took 63. Of course, the crew was treated as national heroes.
I'm impressed. I'm very impressed that they were able to make it in 63 days. In that car, at back during that time, with largely trying to navigate unpaved roads. And yeah, the picture of Bud with the goggles on, that's an impressive showing. The man, initially probably did it for pride and clout, and you know what? He deserves it, 'cause he fucking did it. Absolutely fucking did it.
The Vermont was now a modern marvel. This machine had taken men from one side of the country to the other. Sure, it wasn't as fast as the railroads, but they did it in their own way, while their journey was incredibly difficult. It showed something about the car that few people...
Oh, Blades, why didn't you say something? Or did you and I completely missed it? Did you say something and I missed it? Both one side? Let me see. Where did that article
country
go?
to the other. Sure, it wasn't as fast as the railroads, but they did it in their own way, while their journey was incredibly difficult. It showed something about the car...
Thank you, Llama. Levin, are you talking about here, or are you talking about the article from previous? Like from like a minute ago? You talk. Oh, his sleep made lots of excitement. Oh, yeah. Girls' sleep made lots of excitement. And based on what saying, relatives, friends, boat something, trains, police searched river, supposing her. I'm thinking a girl sleepwalked. I'm thinking this is a story about a girl who's. I'm thinking about this as a girl who went missing while sleepwalking and people were looking for her. That's what I think it is. Yeah. No, Teresa, that's what I'm saying. I think it was, she probably sleepwalked. And because they said they supposed her to be drowning. I'm wondering if she I mean, maybe she just went to sleep somewhere and people couldn't find her, or she was sleepwalking somewhere. I don't know. I don't know.
That few people realized before that point. It had a purpose. It gave you a sense of freedom. These guys picked their own route, visited all the towns they wanted to, moved through the country on their own terms, rather than being forced on a straight path. And because of this, because a car could go across the country, this machine that was disregarded by many as a toy or novelty kinda became something more. Now after this whole adventure, Horatio went home with his wife to Vermont, in the Vermont, which still kept breaking down. He never collected the $50 bet, which makes sense honestly. This was never about the money, but he did end up spending a lot of money. Throughout all of this, he had spent $8,000, which in today's money is about $274,000. With the constant repairs, the incredibly inefficient fuel consumption, lodging costs, food, paying for Crocker to do all of this, it added up. But it proved that you could drive across the country if you really, really wanted to. Eventually, the Packard and Oldsmobile teams made it to New York. The Oldsmobile team was the slowest, but they had a cheeky way of trying to make the most out of this. They dipped their car tires in the Atlantic to try and claim that they had actually gone from the Pacific Ocean to the Atlantic. So you know, that's the one that actually counts.
What?
The Packard team managed to make it in less time overall than Horatio, but they were still in second place. After all of this, with 3 separate teams now crossing the country successfully,
11?
more people became
Apparently
interested
a
in the
lot.
challenge. How fast could you make it from one side to the other? Several more attempts were made by different individuals, cutting the time down quite a bit, but there was clearly a demand for better infrastructure. As cars got cheaper and more people started buying them, there was more incentive to build better roads. And by 1913, the first transcontinental highway was built, the Lincoln Highway. It would take a few more decades for the modern road systems of the US to be built, and even today they still aren't perfect. But if you want to drive from one end of the country to the other, it's a lot easier. This moment, though, in 1903, is still something special. The country that Horatio drove through was really one at the end of an era. A country before modern transportation, one of small, isolated towns, and Horatio got to see a lot of it. And while his intentions were just to prove this one guy wrong, he kinda ended up proving his point to the whole country. After this whole experience, Crocker wanted to try something more ambitious, to go around the world in a car. However, that never really worked out for him. Before he got the chance, he fell ill and died rather young. Horatio Jackson continued being Horatio Jackson, having a successful set of business ventures, but still seeking adventure. He found it in World War I, where he enlisted at the age of 42, going on to be a decorated soldier. In 1944, he donated the Vermont to the Smithsonian. From then on, he would occasionally go and visit his old car at the museum. Horatio's achievements are some of the most bizarre in American history, in all of exploration, actually. Most of these accomplishments in human history are fueled by grand aspirations of fame, wealth, or political edge. But this was a man taking on one of the greatest challenges of the time because he wanted to win an argument, because he liked cars, because he thought it would be fun. And that is Horatio Nelson Jackson.
Wow. That is a man who just... This is a man who, when was told cars cars are fed and you can't make it across country in one, and he just said, hold my beer.